Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Echoes of the Hollow. The small town of Garrison Hollow lay nestled in a forgotten valley, surrounded on all sides by a vast, sprawling forest. The locals called it the Hollow, though its official name Black Pine Woods was rarely spoken. Few ventured past its edge, and those who did often returned changed, shaken, distant, and whispering of things unseen. For as long as anyone could remember, stories of the Hollow had been told, passed down like warnings carved into stone. Some claimed to hear voices when they wandered too far into the woods, soft, lilting echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Others spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed between the trees, moving just out of sight. To most, the forest was a place to avoid, but for Clara Hawthorne, it was an obsession. Clara had set foot in Garrison Hollow for almost 15 years. She had left the town as a teenager, escaping its suffocating small-mindedness and the shadow of her family's tragic history. Her mother, Amelia Hawthorne, had disappeared into the Hollow when Clara was just 7 years old, leaving behind only a tattered scarf found near the forest's edge. Now in her late 20s, Clara had built a life for herself in the city as a freelance journalist, specializing in stories about folklore and the unexplained. When she received an anonymous tip about recent disappearances in Garrison Hollow, she hesitated. The town was the last place she wanted to go, but the pull of the story and the unanswered questions about her mother's fate was too strong to resist. By the time Clara arrived, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The town hadn't changed much in her absence. The same weathered storefronts lined Main Street, and the same handful of locals gathered outside the diner, casting suspicious glances her way. Back for good, Clara? Asked Mrs. Allison, the elderly librarian who had always been kind to her. Just for a story, Clara replied, forcing a smile. Mrs. Allison's expression darkened. Be careful, child. The Hollow hasn't grown any kinder since you left. Clara's first night back in Garrison Hollow was restless. She stayed at her childhood home, a modest house on the outskirts of town that her father had abandoned shortly after her mother's disappearance. It had been sitting empty for years, and the air inside was stale, heavy with memories she'd rather forget. Around midnight, Clara woke to the sound of whispering. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the more she listened, the more distinct the voices became. Clara, she sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was her mother's voice. Clara rushed to the window and peered out into the night. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. The whispering stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed against her ears. The next morning, Clara visited the town archives, hoping to find information about the recent disappearances. According to the records, 3 people had gone missing in the past 6 months: a teenage boy, a local hunter, and an out-of-town hiker. None of their bodies had been found, but all had last been seen near the edge of the Hollow. While flipping through old newspaper clippings, Clara stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. An article from 1997 about her mother's disappearance. The details were sparse, but one line stood out. Witnesses claim Amelia Hawthorne was seen entering the forest, speaking to herself as though answering an unseen voice. Clara's hands trembled as she read the article. Her mother had always been quiet and reserved, but there had been no signs of mental illness, or so she had thought. Was it possible that the whispers were more than just a town legend? She decided to speak with Sheriff Eli Grayson, who had been a deputy at the time of her mother's disappearance. When she arrived at the sheriff's office, Eli greeted her with a mixture of warmth and caution. Clara, he said, leaning back in his chair, I heard you were back in town. What brings you here? I'm writing a story about the Hollow, Clara said. I need to know what's really going on with the disappearances and what happened to my mother. Eli's expression darkened. Some things are better left alone. Please, Eli, Clara pressed. I need answers. He sighed and leaned forward, lowering his voice. I've seen things out there, Clara, things I can't explain. Your mother wasn't the first to go missing, and she won't be the last. Whatever's in that forest, it doesn't let go of the people it takes. That evening, Clara stood at the edge of the forest, the shadows stretching out before her like an open maw. She clutched a flashlight in one hand and a recorder in the other, her pulse quickening. As she stepped into the Hollow, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around her. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the distant rustle of branches. She followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods, guided by an inexplicable pull. The deeper she went, the more disoriented she became. The forest seemed to shift around her, the path twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Then she heard it again whispering, "Clara, this way." Her flashlight flickered, and the beam illuminated a figure standing just ahead. It was a woman, her back turned, her hair cascading over her shoulders in familiar waves. "Mom," Claire's voice broke as she called out. The figure turned, but before Claire could see her face, the flashlight went out, plunging her into darkness. When the light flickered back on, the figure was gone, but in the distance, Clara saw a faint glow of warm, flickering light like a candle or a fire. She followed it, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. The light led her to a small, dilapidated cabin hidden deep within the forest. Its windows glowed with an eerie amber light, and the door creaked open as she approached. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and something metallic. On the table sat a single, unlit lantern, and beside it, an old journal. Clara opened the journal, her hands trembling. The entries were written in her mother's handwriting. "The voices are calling. They say they can't bring him back. I don't know if I can trust them, but I have no choice. If it means saving him, I'll do whatever it takes." Clara's stomach churned. Her mother had been trying to bring someone back, but who? And what had the voices promised her in return? As she flipped through the journal, the whispers grew louder, swelling into a deafening chorus. The last entry sent chills down her spine. "I've gone too far. There's no turning back now. If someone finds this, forgive me." The cabin door slammed shut, and the light in the lantern flared to life, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Clara turned, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was the figure she had seen in the woods. This time, there was no mistaking her face. "Mom," Clara whispered. But the woman didn't respond. Her eyes were hollow, her face twisted into an expression of sorrow and pain. And then, the whispers spoke as one. "You shouldn't have come here." The eerie apparition of her mother vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Clara alone in the dimly lit cabin. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. The whispers had quieted, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against her chest. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken and ancient, as if the very forest were alive and watching her. But Clara wasn't ready to leave it yet, not when she was finally on the verge of uncovering the truth. Clara flipped back through the tattered journal, its brittle pages trembling in her hands. The words were a mix of frantic scrawls and deliberate, meticulous notes. Her mother had written about the voices, describing how they called to her night after night, promising impossible things. "They say they can't bring him back. I hear him in the echoes, his laughter in the wind. I know it's him, but the price they ask, I don't know if I can pay it." Clara paused. Who was her mother trying to bring back? Her father had left shortly after Amelia's disappearance, but he was still alive. She'd seen him a few years ago, living in a distant city with a new family. Then it struck her. Amelia wasn't trying to save her husband. She was trying to save her son. Clara's older brother, Daniel, had drowned in the river when he was 10 years old. She had been too young to understand the depth of her mother's grief at the time. But now, reading these pages, the pieces fell into place. Amelia had been lured into the forest by promises of bringing Daniel back to life. But why hadn't she returned? Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. She frowned, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until they stopped just outside the door. "Who's in there?" a gruff voice called out. Clara exhaled, relief washing over her. The voice belonged to a man, not a ghost or some otherworldly entity. She opened the door cautiously to find an older man standing on the porch, a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was lined and withered, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "This is private property," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't mean to trespass," Clara said quickly. "I was just looking for answers." The man's gaze softened slightly as he studied her. "You're Amelia's girl, aren't you?" Clara nodded. The man sighed, leaning his rifle against the porch railing. "Name's Leonard," he said. "I used to hunt out here, back before the forest turned. Strange." "Strange how?" Clara asked. Leonard gestured toward the woods. "You felt it, haven't you? The hollow isn't like other forests. It's got a mind of its own, and it doesn't take kindly to outsiders." He hesitated, then added, "Your mother knew that, but she didn't listen." "What happened to her?" Clara asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Leonard shook his head. I don't know for sure, but I saw her the night she went missing. She was walking into the woods, talking to someone I couldn't see. I tried to stop her, but she just looked at me and said, "It's the only way." The only way to what? To get him back, Leonard said grimly. She was talking about your brother, wasn't she? Clara nodded, her throat tight. Leonard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver amulet engraved with strange symbols. Take this, he said, pressing it into her hand. It's not much, but it might help keep the worst of the forest at bay. If you're going in there, you'll need all the help you can get. Clara left the cabin shortly after Leonard departed, his words echoing in her mind. The forest felt darker now, the trees looming like silent sentinels. She clutched the amulet tightly, its cool surface grounding her as she pressed on. The whispers returned as she ventured deeper into the woods, soft and persistent, like a half-forgotten melody. This time, they weren't just calling her name, they were guiding her, leading her towards something. Her flashlight flickered, and she stopped, her breath catching. In the distance, she saw faint lights weaving between the trees, small, glowing orbs that bobbed and swayed like willow wisps. Follow, the whispers urged. Against her battered judgment, Clara obeyed. The orbs led her to a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle. In the center stood a large, gnarled tree, its bark blackened as if by fire. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, and at its base lay a pile of bones, human and animal, scattered and broken. Clara's stomach turned, but she forced herself to approach. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if the tree itself were speaking to her. Here! As Clara touched the tree's bark, a surge of energy shot through her, and the world around her dissolved. She was no longer in the forest, but in a dreamlike void, surrounded by shadows and flickering lights. In the distance, she saw her mother, standing by the river where Daniel had drowned. Amelia was crying, her hands outstretched toward a figure emerging from the water. Daniel, Clara whispered, but the figure wasn't her brother. It was a distorted, grotesque mockery of him, its limbs still long, its face featureless. It reached for Amelia, its movements jerky and unnatural. No, Amelia screamed, but it was too late. The thing grabbed her, dragging her into the water as she struggled in vain. The vision shifted, and Clara saw her mother in the forest, surrounded by shadowy figures with glowing eyes. They whispered to her, their voices a cacophony of promises and threats. Amelia knelt before them, weeping as she offered her hands in surrender. Then the vision ended, and Clara was back in the clearing, her body trembling. Clara stumbled away from the tree, her mind racing. The hollow wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, corrupted by something ancient and malevolent. The whispers weren't spirits, they were part of the forest itself, luring people in with promises of impossible desires. Her mother had been tricked, just as countless others had been. As Clara turned to leave, she heard a new sound, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. She spun around, her flashlight catching a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness. The creature stepped into the light, its form twisted and unnatural, its movements eerily familiar. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was the thing from her vision, thing that had taken her mother. Clara stood frowning, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The creature before her was a grotesque parody of a human, its long, distorted limbs bending unnaturally, its glowing eyes fixed on her. It radiated an aura of malice and hunger. And yet, deep in her chest, Clara felt something else, is something terrifyingly familiar. Daniel, she whispered, the name slipping from her lips unbidden. The creature's head tilted, its body convulsing as if struggling to respond. For a fleeting moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of recognition in its glowing eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The growling deepened, and the creature lunged. Clara barely had time to react. She dove to the side, the creature's claws slashing through the air where she'd been standing moments before. Scrambling to her feet, she bolted into the forest, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. The whispers grew louder, merging with the sound of heavy footfalls behind her. The forest seemed to close in, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap her. Clara's lungs burned, her legs aching as she pushed herself harder. The amulet Leonard had given her bouncing against her chest. A sharp branch snagged her jacket, pulling her to a halt. She yanked herself free, stumbling into a narrow ravine. The creature's guttural growls echoed above her, but it didn't follow. Instead, it lingered at the edge, pacing back and forth, its glowing eyes tracking her every movement. For the moment, she was safe. Clara crouched in the ravine, trying to catch her breath. Her mind raced as she pieced together what she had seen. The creature wasn't just a random monster, it was tied to the hollow, a manifestation of the forest corruption. And somehow, It was connected to her brother. Before she could dwell on it further, a voice called out from the shadows. "Hey, over here." Clara whipped around to see a young woman standing at the far end of the ravine, holding a lantern. Her dark hair was tied back, and her clothes were caked in mud, as though she'd been wandering the forest for days. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse. "Erin," the woman replied. "I've been stuck in here for a week. I think we're both looking for a way out." Clara hesitated, but the desperation in Erin's voice convinced her to follow. Together, they made their way through the ravine, the creature's growls fading into the distance. As they walked, Erin explained her situation. She was a hiker who had wandered close to the hollow while passing through Garrison. The forest had seemed normal at first, but the deeper she went, the stranger it became. "It's like it wants to keep you here," Erin said. "Every time I think I'm getting close to the edge, the paths change. I've seen things I can't explain." Clara nodded. "I know what you mean. My mom disappeared here when I was a kid. I came back to find out what happened to her." Erin's expression darkened. "Then you should know. The forest doesn't let go of the people it takes." The two women traveled together, navigating the forest's ever-shifting terrain. Clara shared what she had learned about the hollow's whispers and its ability to lure people in with promises of their deepest desires. Erin listened intently, her own experiences confirming Clara's suspicions. "The voices tried to trick me too," Erin said. "They said they could bring my sister back. She died in a car accident last year." "I think that's how it works," Clara said. "It preys on grief, on desperation." As they talked, Clara noticed something strange. The amulet Leonard had given her seemed to glow faintly, its symbols pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She held it up, and the glow intensified, casting a soft light that cut through the forest's oppressive darkness. "It's reacting to something," Erin said. Clara nodded. "I think it's showing us the way." They followed the amulet's glow, wading deeper into the forest until they came to another clearing. This one was even more unsettling than the last. In the center stood a massive stone altar, its surface covered in dried blood and carved with symbols identical to those on the amulet. Surrounding the altar were figures cloaked in shadow, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness. They turned as Clara and Erin approached, their glowing eyes locking onto them. "Who or what are they?" Erin whispered. "I don't know," Clara replied, clutching the amulet tightly. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling Clara's mind with fragments of her mother's voice. "It's the only way. I had to try. Forgive me." Clara stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the altar. "This is where it happened," she said. "This is where my mom made her deal." The shadowy figures parted as Clara approached the altar, their glowing eyes unblinking. She placed the amulet on the stone surface, and the air around her seemed to hum with energy. A voice spoke in it, a whisper, but a deep, resonant tone that echoed through the clearing. "You seek the truth," it said. Clara swallowed hard. "I want to know what happened to my mother, and I want to know why the hollow is like this." The voice chuckled, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Your mother sought to bring back what was lost. She paid the price, as all must." "What price?" Clara demanded. "Her soul," the voice replied. "To restore one life, another must be taken. She gave herself willingly, but the forest is never satisfied. It grows hungry, always searching for more." Clara's heart sank. Her mother hadn't been trickish, had made the ultimate sacrifice, trading her life for the chance to bring Daniel back. But something had gone wrong. Daniel hadn't returned as himself. He had become something else. "Is there a way to stop this?" Clara asked. The voice paused, its tone shifting to one of amusement. "Perhaps, but the forest demands balance. If you wish to win the hollow's curse, you must take your mother's place." Clara's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "You must offer yourself to the forest," the voice said. "Only then will its hunger be sated." Clara's mind raced. She had come to the hollow seeking answers, but now she was faced with an impossible choice: sacrifice herself to save others, or leave and let the forest continue its cycle of death and despair. Erin grabbed her arm. "You can't do this, Clara. There has to be another way." Clara looked at the amulet, its glow now steady and strong. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifice she had made, and of the countless others who had been lured into the hollow's grasp. "I don't know if there is," Clara said, her voice trembling. Before she could decide, the growling returned. The creature Daniel emerged from the shadows, its twisted form illuminated by the altar's light. It stopped a few feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on Clara. For a moment, it seemed almost human. "Clara," it rasped, its voice barely audible. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she stepped toward it. Daniel, is that really you? The creature reached out, its claws trembling. Clara hesitated, then took its hand. The forest exploded with light, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The forest was ablaze with light, an ethereal glow emanating from the altar. As Clara clasped the creature's trembling hand, the whispers swirled in a deafening chorus. The air alive with energy so thick it was suffocating. Clara could feel it now. Hollow wasn't just cursed. It was sentient, ancient, and hungry. The creature before her, Daniel, was no longer growling. Its glowing eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, Clara thought she could see her brother in its monstrous form. But that moment shattered as the shadows surrounding them surged forward, the shadowy figures by the altar closing in. Clara, let go! Aaron's voice broke through the cacophony. But Clara couldn't. Something was binding her to the creature, to the forest itself. The amulet around her neck grew hot, searing her skin as the ancient symbols on the altar pulsed with light. The forest was demanding a decision. The voice returned, deep and resonant, shaking Clara to her core. The choice is yours, Clara. Stay, and the forest will be sated. Leave, and the cycle continues. Clara's mind raced. She had come to the hollow to find her mother, to uncover the truth, but she hadn't expected to face the weight of such a decision. The faces of those she loved flashed in her mind: her mother, her brother, even Aaron, who had risked her life to help a stranger. What happens to him? Clara asked, her voice barely audible. She gestured to Daniel's twisted form. The voice was silent for a moment before responding. He will remain, as he is a reflection of your mother's grief, bound to the forest for eternity. Unless what? Clara demanded. Unless you take his place, restore the balance. Your sacrifice will free him, but the hollow's hunger will still require a keeper. Clara's grip on Daniel's hand tightened. She looked into his glowing eyes, searching for the brother she had lost so many years ago. Clara, don't, Aaron said, stepping closer. There has to be another way. We can figure this out together. But Clara knew Aaron was wrong. The hollow was ancient, its roots buried deep in the fabric of the world. It couldn't be defeated by them, not by anyone. The best she could do was break the cycle, even if it meant sacrificing herself. Clara stepped onto the altar, the amulet around her neck glowing brighter than ever. The shadowy figures hissed and recoiled as she raised her head, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. I'll do it, she said. I'll stay. The forest shuddered, the trees creaking and groaning as if responding to her words. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence that was almost worse. The creature Daniel reached for her, its movement slow and hesitant, as its claws brushed her arm. Clara felt a surge of warmth, a flood of memories that weren't hers, laughter by the river, the weight of her mother's arms around her, the sharp pain of drowning. Daniel's form began to shift, the grotesque features melting away. For a moment, he was whole again, a boy of 10, his face streaked with tears. Clara, he whispered, his voice trembling. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. It's okay, Daniel, you're free now. The boy smiled, his form dissolving into light. The hollow absorbed him, the energy rippling outward like a shockwave. As Daniel disappeared, Clara felt the forest change. The oppressive darkness lifted, the air growing lighter, cleaner, but she also felt something else yet other, binding her to the hollow, sinking deep into her soul. The shadows around the altar surged forward, enveloping her. She gasped as the amulet fused to her chest, its symbols burning into her skin. The pain was excruciating, but it was over quickly, leaving behind a strange numbness. When the shadows receded, Clara was no longer the same. She could feel the forest's pulse, its thoughts merging with hers. She was part of it, no its new keeper. Aaron stared at her, horror and sorrow etched on her face. Clara, what have you done? I had to, Clara said, her voice distant. It was the only way. Aaron stepped forward, but the shadows around Clara stopped her. You need to go, Clara said. The hollow won't hurt you now, but it won't let you stay either. Aaron's eyes filled with tears. I can't just leave you here. You have to, Clara said. Please, Aaron, live for both of us. Aaron hesitated but finally nodded, tears streaming down her face. She turned and walked away, the path through the forest opening before her. Clara watched until Aaron disappeared into the distance, the glow of her lantern fading into the night. The forest was silent now, the whispers gone. Clara stood alone by the altar, her body heavy with the weight of her decision. The hollow pulsed around her, alive and aware. She could feel its hunger, its need, but she could also feel its gratitude. For the first time in centuries, it was content. Clara Saturday by the altar, her gaze fixed on the dark canopy above. She thought of her mother, her brother, and the lives that had been lost to the hollow. Her sacrifice had broken the cycle, but she knew it was only temporary. The forest would grow hungry again someday, and when it did, she would be there to ensure it never claimed another innocent soul. Years later, hikers passing near the hollow would speak of a strange phenomenon, a faint voice in the wind, guiding lost travelers back to safety. Some claimed to see a woman in the forest, her figure wreathed in shadows, her eyes glowing softly. She never spoke, but her presence was a comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there could be light. Clara had become the hollow's guardian, its echo, and though she was bound to it forever, she found peace in knowing she had saved those she loved and ensured no one else would suffer the same fate.